Welcome in, everybody, to another episode of Discard for Magic. I'm one of your hosts, Aaron.
And I'm the other host, James or Jexic. And today we're pretty happy to have on Beaneasly or Bean.
Hey guys, happy to be here talking about my favorite game.
And your favorite faction, the Mountain Vargath.
That's right.
Is it your favorite faction?
I have a lot of favorite factions. If I'm talking about it on this podcast, yeah, I think it bumps it up there for sure.
Awesome. Why don't you just start out and tell us like a little bit of how you got into Summoner Wars?
Yeah, so my brother, who is like big into board games and tries every board game, he had always heard about the first edition. I don't think he ever played it. And then when they were coming out with the second edition, they did that little, I don't know if you guys did this, the prelude to what became the like Summoner Wars Online, where you could play as just the Cave Goblins and the Breakers. Do you guys play that at all?
Yeah, I did.
Yeah, the beta.
Yeah. That was, and we played that a couple times, and I got to play as the Cave Goblins, another one of my favorite factions, but that was really fun. And then when the Master Set came out, he bought it for me, and we played a bunch, and I just got really hooked. And then my roommate, he lives in another city, my brother, so my roommate and I ended up playing it a ton together, and it just it's a game that has so much like depth. Obviously, I mean, you guys know this, but like so much variability in the factions, and even if you play the same factions over and over, like every single game is different, and you feel like you're learning stuff. It's just such a fun time.
Was your roommate also on the Discord, or am I thinking of the wrong person?
There's a couple of my real life buddies on the Discord. My roommate used to be in the league, and he was pretty good, but he just he stopped playing really and is focusing on real life stuff, unfortunately for him. But my other buddy Davoud is in the league and just actually came second in overall in Div 1. So
Smacked me around, that's for sure.
Yeah, I know the feeling. He is way too good.
Yeah, Davoud's really good. So, did you ever try first edition?
No, I've never tried first edition. I work at a used bookstore actually, and we get the first edition in every once in a while because we'll sell board games and stuff. And it's fun, like looking at it and looking at the old Mountain Vargath, right? And the art is so different. It's a culture shock to me, honestly. It'd be like, whoa, they're just standing there completely stoic and stern looking compared to the art nowadays where it's cartoonish and actiony. But no, I never played it.
Gameplay wise, the Mountain Vargath are one of the factions that changed the least, probably broadly. You know, like their commanders or the summoner's ability is very similar.
Yeah, almost the exact same.
Because it used to just work on commons, but now it works for champions too.
It's a good ability, obviously, and it has a lot of just like depth and uses of it, right, that are not really necessarily apparent in just the one sentence of like units within 2 have +1 strength, right? It like forces you to group together and gives this bonus to all these things, but then like makes it so that all the commons are statted towards health versus towards attack, so that boost really means something. And I think that's just kind of a cool type of deck that exists. Like these things are not strong on their own, but they're strong together, like a herd, like a flock of rams or goats, right?
What are some of the key tips you would say for people who are just starting to play Mountain Vargath? Like, what are some things they should keep in mind in their first couple plays?
Yeah, I think like Mountain Vargath is a faction that's really adaptable, right? It can be used aggressively, it can be used defensively, it can be used kind of economically just because they are so beefy and like sturdy, and things can last a lot longer on the board than normal. To me, I would just try and match what the opponent is doing, right? If they're playing super defensively, you maybe want to move up to like counter that. If they're playing super aggressively, you can meet them that way, or you can play really defensively. It's more of a tactical faction than it is one that I think has a big strategy or like overarching, this is what you want to do. And I think that's one that I really enjoy because of it. If we're going like basic tips, I'd say get a lot of magic and get a lot of commons on the board, because it really is, you are stronger the more things you have, right? And I think that it plays into its kind of harmony deck building symbol, right? There's that, and then there's the primal one, which is just total strength and power and things like that. Can be aggression, can be kind of like ability to charge forward. But if you have a lot of stuff, like everything plays well together. The brutes are really good. They're huge and can hit for 3. The glory collars fit everything together. The slingers are really powerful and they rarely get hit because they're hidden behind everything. Just having a ton of stuff on the board makes it so you can do a lot of things, a lot of combos, a lot of attacks, and it's usually stays on the board too because they're so high health.
With the one exception being the slingers, but like you said, they're behind the lines, so they generally don't get hit.
There's certain factions that can get to them, but it usually costs something or it puts them out of position in order to do so.
Do you feel like there are any of their 4 commons that you tend to play less than the rest, or do you feel like it's a good mix?
I think it's a pretty good mix. I'd say the ones that I play the least are probably the fighters, the Slagborn fighters, I think is their full name. Those guys, and I think that's just a personal preference thing because when I play Tundra Works, which I played a lot, I was never one of those people who could get off a really cool Brutal Force turn. And so I just don't see the like matrix for that, right? I know, Aaron, you know all about Brutal Force.
Yeah, and they're like Brutal Force light. Like, I love a good fighter turn just to get like a summoner out of position or a champ into like Sunderved's attack range and keep Sunderved safe.
The deck seems to have like a surprising amount of control that way between the fighters and the brutes also being able to push not only other units but even summoners.
And I definitely play the fighters around and stuff. And I think their ability to push things, it's different than what the Tundra Orcs have. Like, I feel like that one, you're pushing to kind of like bully some faction or bully a summoner or whatever it is that you're pushing. With the fighters, I generally am like pushing them towards my things that are in the back so they can hit it more, or pushing them towards my summoner who is in a relatively safe position or something like that. And it is kind of like playing into the more harmonic, synergistic elements.
Or you play into that primal aspect and you just hit your summoner towards the opponent to get to that big play.
Totally. That would be crazy.
There used to be a big thing with what was called the brute in the first edition. Instead of knocking something 1 space, they'd knock them up to 3. So people used to send Sunderved right at the enemy just to try to get kills that way.
Oh my goodness. Pushing something 3 is pretty nuts.
It's like Blast for the Breakers.
There's been a lot of glory color hate when they came out. Do you think glory colors are weak? Do you think they're not as useful as the other 3 commons? What do you feel?
Me personally, I love things that like people tend to put down or like undervalue. And I think it's easy to do that for glory colors because if you just look at the card, you see 1 attack, 4 health, and an ability that only triggers at the onset of a turn or of the first time it's summoned, and that's it. And so it's like, well, this is pretty lame or worthless. But you have to think 90% of the time you're going to have a glory caller within the range if you're attacking, range of Sunderved. So it's going to be a 2/4, same like stat as a lot of things that are 2 cost are that stat. And then also its ability is really powerful in the deck. Pushing a brute forward to then ram something is huge, right? Or pushing anything forward, pushing Sunderved to the side so that you can then set up a huge ramming turn. There are a lot of uses for it, and a lot of them are necessary in order for the deck to really sing and do what it's supposed to do. Like I had a game against Chibata, which was actually a live game that we were doing. That was fun, but the first turn, it was me against the Deepwood Grokes, and I put out 2 glory callers to then force my brute all the way forward and then occupy his gate spot because I rammed something off the gate. And both of us agreed like that was a huge for the turn to like just occupy that gate spot with a 5 health brute, and then that really sets up the aggression because it's so hard to eliminate that thing in front of the gate. There's a lot of things you can do with Glory Colors, so I think they're really powerful, and they are more of a support unit, right? But that support is necessary, and they can also be those just like mobile parapets for slingers, also too.
Mobile parapets. I have not heard that yet, but I like it.
Because parapets should have 4 health anyway, right? No.
A conversation for another day.
Yeah, but they're good, and they're just as a tank, right? You do want like beefy things in the front lines, and so if you have those things that are cheap and you can throw in the front, like that's helpful on its own, also too.
Yeah, I think that they get a bit undervalued because people see that stat line of 1-4 and they're like, what? 1 attack.
Yeah, I mean, there are some other really good 1/4s for 1, like Frost Mages and Deceivers and stuff. I think it's not a bad stat line on its own, really. Because that's a lot of health for 1 magic, you know?
And their ability is, it seems simple, but it makes the deck so like intricate because every turn has so much more possibilities if you have a Glory Color in hand. Like you said, you can set up ramming advances, you can push a fighter in extra space and ping someone back into range of something else. You can push a brute further. You can move Sunderbed 1 more space to get that 3 movement, to get that range that you need to get to somebody. Like it opens up so many avenues.
Yeah, I think it makes it a lot harder for your opponent to think about what the Vargath can do to you. A lot of times you kind of count space and say, okay, I'm safe from whatever shenanigans they're gonna pull. But then suddenly a Glory Collar or 2 pops out and moves something 1 or 2 spaces, or forces it 1 or 2 spaces, and suddenly like the whole board shifts and does something different. So I agree that Glory Collars are perhaps underrated or maybe getting more accurately valued now.
I think a lot of the strength of the Vargath comes from their like health, but also they have a lot of tricks and things that you would not see coming, like you're talking about Jexic, or things that are really have a lot of possibilities to the point where I don't even know when I'm doing things a lot of the time if it's the most powerful thing or if it's the best use of the ability. But I just love exploring and being like, all right, I'm gonna martial forces Barn over here, who then forms up with something in the front, and you just have all these different ways to move stuff and force stuff, which is not super apparent when you just look at the cards on their own, or I've only played them a couple times. And Glory Colors are a huge part of that, I think.
So now that you've brought up Martial Forces and Varn, do you want to jump into the champions or the events next?
Let's do the events.
What's your least favorite event right off the bat? Just give it to me.
It's probably ramming events. I mean, it's definitely the most situational of the events. But the thing is, it's situational a lot of the time because you aren't planning for it. So what I like to do a lot on my first turn against factions that don't have a super strong ranged game, so if I'm playing like the Vanguards or something like that, is I'll move Sunderved, kind of expose him a little bit to the side, but just threaten that ramming advance whether I have it or not. And because your opponent, if they know the Vargath, have to be thinking about that and think, okay, he could come down, place a gate, come down, martial force something up, or other things join him and stuff like that. So like it really does take planning. When you first see it, you're like, oh, this is so cool, but it is weak if you don't set it up. You have to set it up, basically.
I find a lot of times you might only get 1 or 2 units to actually get the benefit, even though it affects your whole squad.
If you are playing aggressively, which I tend to do, or I like to do a lot of the time, is huge. And you want to move up together. You don't want to just have one thing going solo because it's a lot weaker if you're doing that way.
Yeah, and I find that even if you're not have all the units in position, sometimes you can threaten like a gate destruction, which is often scary if you're playing against the Vargath. Like I was playing a game recently against Fuzzy in one of the Shabata games, and Fuzzy was playing Vargath, I was playing Crimson Order, and I had to position my units in a way that like Fuzzy had a couple units lined up for ramming advance, or like in a position to use it. I didn't even know if Fuzzy had it. I never saw it come out, and I was worried about my gate just getting covered on all three of like the front and both sides with a ramming advance, and me then not being able to summon and like having to deal with the gate probably dying that turn or the turn after.
Totally. That's something too that just in the like normal course of play, I feel like I have destroyed more 10 health gates with the Vargath than almost any faction. Maybe Cave Goblins is up there too, but because of the fact that they have slingers who can attack through them that same column, like a lot of times I'll do my first turn against factions and put their gate and like attack their gate twice and it'll get it down to like 5 or 6 health, and that's such a like dangerous position for an opponent to be in a lot of the time. Like they don't have another gate.
Especially if they're thinking they're just going to play a long econ game, maybe they're not discarding too many cards and they might not see their other gate for a while.
And like you're saying, Aaron, that the ramming can be a big part of that too, right? You can threaten with Thunderved, you can come down with 5 attack or 6 attack if you're using Battle Leader and really lay a wall up on that gate.
Often out of nowhere, like you don't even have to have units on the board. If you have like gates in a decent position, you can summon a couple units and just fly down the battlefield and take out a gate real fast, often in one turn. Sometimes it takes 2, but it's just an ability they have that they're very strong at, flying straight at you when you least expect it. I love that change of momentum. They could be playing defensive, playing that mid game, and then just launch right towards you. It's almost like the avians in a sense, but the avians is like more expected, I feel like. Like when you play against the avians, you're always like, okay, these units can get flight. If they summon here, they can get flight. That's what can fly at me. But with the goats, if they get a ramming turn, they can come at you from anywhere. Anywhere they got a unit or can summon, like.
Well, and you get the extra attack too, which is huge.
And you can even summon something, glory color it over, and then ramming advance around stuff.
I think also too, you're talking about having a gate in the right position. I think that's a big factor for ramming, setting up a ramming too, is you don't necessarily want to put a gate if you're trying to set up a ramming. You don't want to put it on the third row because then you summon something, moving it 3 or 4 spaces with ramming is probably going to be too far, right? So if you put it on that third row, that's maybe even too close if you're trying to set up a ramming. Whereas if you put it on the second row, I tend to do like A2, so like leftmost on the second row. That can be a really good spot to threaten the ramming, or on the other side versus on the third row, which then is not as strong, I feel like, for that specifically.
What do you feel about the other 3 events? Battle Leader, Stronghold, and Martial Forces. How do you feel about those ones?
They're all really strong, and I rarely discard them. Like, I am a person who likes playing events and comboing things off of each other. And they all play really well together, too, which is something I like about their events. Something like, Fallen Kingdom, if you have a handful of events, you're kind of like screwed, right? There are other factions like that, too. Whereas if you have a unit on the board, which is likely in the case of the Mountain Vargath, then having a handful of events, and if they're all different, is really good. If you go ramming, run up, martial forces something in front of you to protect you after you kill something, put a gate down up there, or go ramming, stronghold out of there, or do battle leader, which then exposes your summoner, and then martial forces, which then protects them. Like, they all play really well together, which is something I really like about this faction too. And I think they're all really strong, right? Having an extra attack and it being your summoner just encourages this play style of aggression and strength, and really thoughtful aggression and strength too, because you don't want to just expose him, but you do want to use it because it's strong. And then martial forces has a lot of uses, especially it being champion or common. You can get Barn, who then brings something up. You can go all in with Torridon and then bring him back to safety so he doesn't die. Like, there's a lot of uses for it.
Yeah, I feel like the fact that he only has 12 health but 4 strength and the aura kind of lends to an interesting play style where you want him involved but like not exposed, but he has tools to protect himself with martial forces and other things.
That's kind of how I feel like when they're being played and they feel the most powerful is when you're just like creeping forward, or like ramming forward, and then you're there. But you want to have it be like controlled aggression, Whereas something like, cave goblins can just be all out aggression, or obsidian dwarves can be like, I don't know, brute force aggression, or like risk taking aggression. The aggression of the Mountain Vargath can be really calculated and kind of forces you to bring those things closer to your summoner, because then you are getting the most out of them. You're getting the most attack out of them, and you're protecting your summoner at the same time. So I think it's a really interesting design, and I enjoy like using Sunderved, but knowing when to use him and when not to is kind of the game of it, like you're talking about, Jexic.
So you said all the events are good and they can be used together. So let's get to the champions, because I think that might be one of the more controversial topics with them.
People love Varn. People maybe say he's too strong. I said this on a recent stream with Ben 10, but I think he's strong. The thing that he does is in the context of the deck, right? It's not like he's strong completely on his own. He's strong because you are doing the deck the best way that you can do the deck. So it really is like, on his own, he's nothing, right? If he doesn't have any commons around, he's just his own thing, or champions around, he's just a bunch of health and stats. But if you're using him at the best of his abilities, it's because you're using him smartly, or using him in the way that this deck wants you to use it, which is keeping Sunderved safe and using the aura and keeping Varn safe. The thing that makes him really powerful, I think, is just the utility, right? You can use him aggressively, to bring things forward. You can use it to expose a unit and then pull it to safety. You can use it to attack with Sunderved and then protect Sunderved. Like, there's a lot of different ways.
And also the fact that it's any time during the turn. That's the biggest thing, because you can use it to like free up an extra summoning spot, bring them out, summon something, and then form up to get that summoning space open, or form up with like brutes is crazy because they don't move fast, but he can make them go 3 spaces, like just like that, and then move, like.
I love putting like forming up with a brute, and that's then next to another brute, and you can just get a double ram next to each other, off of them working off of each other. It's a great feeling.
If you get the magic to use it with champs, that makes the other champs that much better too. If you're that insane to have Torden and Varn out at the same time, absolutely crazy stuff you can do. But even just if you have the magic for Quen and Varn, which is more reasonable, you can keep Quen alive so long, doing such good amounts of damage to the opponent at range, which this deck doesn't have a whole lot of, and then pull Quen to safety with Varn or Martial Forces and continue, or even Stronghold, and continue to keep that ranged onslaught going.
Yeah, I think I've had a couple of games. I actually had one, the most recent Ciabatta tournament, where I had both Varn and Torden, and it just felt so strong. It was going against the Forged too, so it was like climbing over all their structures with Torden and pulling them back to safety. Feels like you're a god out there with so much power. Like Varn, we talked about going on to Torden, who I think is really interesting as a champion. Obviously, you're not going to summon him every game. It's just not possible with an 8-cost champion. But it is something that, going in, I never thought I would be able to summon an 8-cost champion. Savannah Elves, when they have one, even if it was good, I don't think I would ever have the magic in order to get to it in Midi Tree. And then with like Phoenix Elves, they've got the Fire Drake, and I've seen it come out against like Cave Goblins or things where you can get a lot of kills. Crimson Order might be something else too. I wouldn't ever see it that way. Whereas Torden, I find myself having a lot of magic almost without planning for it a lot with these guys, just because they have so much health, so they stick around longer, so you don't need to summon as much normally. And so you're not going to end up with like 8 magic that way, but you might end up with 4 or 5, and then you could discard just a couple to get up to 8, and you've got, all of a sudden, you've got this huge thing that can go pretty much anywhere. Attacks for 3 on its own, or 4 with Sunderved. It can go, if you ramming advance it, you can go 5 spaces, which is absolutely insane, over anything.
I think another thing to keep in mind too is that like we were saying with Varn, he's not that good unless you have other units out. So like If you have neither champion in your hand, you can discard to 8 to hope to get Varn and a common or Torridon. Like, it's kind of a flexible thing. We're just, like you said, having a lot of magic in itself is helpful with this faction, just to keep your options open. Yeah.
If you're investing 8 magic in something, you want it to have a huge impact, right? And so you can't just be willy-nilly with him and throw him. Like, he could go anywhere, but you don't want to put him anywhere. He has a lot of health. He's going to last likely a turn just based off of that. But if you are playing recklessly with him, he won't get a ton of impact after that one turn. Whereas you have all these tools like Farm, like Martial Forces, Stronghold, all these things to keep him in different safe spots over the course of the game, which I think is really like the game of it as well. Once you get Torridon out, do you want to have him? Like, how can you get him to have the most impact he can?
Yeah, I think Torridon is probably the toughest one for me because I struggle getting to that magic count. I've still played him in a couple games, and he can be very, very strong. I've also had to deal with him in a couple games, and against a lot of, like, even the ones that you said are better with some of the other big champions, like against like the Crimson Order and stuff. Torridon still does so much work against those factions with that clump a lot, and he can trample in and deal a lot of damage, and then you can pull him back with one of those tools.
Factions that have a lot of units on the board, like Crimson Order, Fallen Kingdom, Cave Goblins, you can often get Torridon out, and he'll do work.
Forged 2, I think, is a really good matchup for him. Like, I would almost try to discard to get up to 8 for it because Forged think they're safe a lot of the time by putting a structure down in front of the inventor, but if you have Torridon, you're just constantly threatening.
Yeah, and his ability to climb over structures and then just get at the low health summoner of the inventor is very useful for sure. It can be hard for him to like put a lot of output out on Torridon and be safe because, like you said, he's putting down structures that he can just step over with Torridon. So
it forces them to play too, like, defensively in a way that's not the way that the Forged want to play. They want to be up in your front and using Forged in Flames.
What do you think of Gwen?
Gwen for me is definitely the least summoned of the champions. I think the ability is really strong, even though sometimes it does self-immolate yourself. And it was kind of a shock to the system the first time when I was next to something and I attacked and Gwen took damage from that. It seems like something that, I don't know, I feel like they should have worded that differently so it doesn't happen. Gwen is tough just because health is really low. And you can use Martial Forces or Varn and things like that in order to keep Gwen safe. And if you're doing that, it's going to be really powerful. It's going to be attacking for 4 with other direct damage almost every turn that you can do that. But for me, I have a tough time doing that and keeping her safe. So I don't always get Gwen out. I think she's powerful when used the right way. I also think it's kind of funny. I've talked about this before too, where the direct damage part of her ability doesn't affect summoners. I get why they did that, right? Like, it would be pretty powerful to reach a summoner that way. But thematically, in my head, I'm like, how is this lightning that's reaching all this other stuff around the thing not affecting summoners? Like, are they made of rubber? Are they like.
the summoning stone just warps the lightning.
Yeah, it's like lightning rod. That's the summoning stone. Seems like, Aaron, you were talking about playing Gwen with Varn. I don't think I've ever done that before.
It's a good time for sure. Gwen with Varn, you can get some huge attacks and get some of that lightning damage, that chain lightning, and then just pull back to safety. And Gwen can stay alive for an obscene amount of time.
I could see that happening, and that's probably the best use of Gwen too, because that's an every single turn pull to safety.
I imagine it could be another good way to deal with the Forged if you don't have Torridon. Hit and then pull back, and because they're not going to get to her, you know, like
Yeah, same thing.
any range units against the Forged, and that's what I think is one interesting thing about the Vargath is they have very limited range. It's just Gwen and the 5 slingers if you count the starting setup. So it's like you really gotta like protect your range units in this deck, I think.
But it is something you can do, especially with slingers. That's just like naturally what they do, right? If you have them out to the side, unprotected, you're probably not using them the best that you can. That's why you got to have the mobile parapets moving around.
Do you think the Vargath are stronger when they're aggressive? We've talked about how they're like a very flexible faction. Like they can be defensive, they can be aggressive, they can play the midfield, they can play econ. But do you think they're strongest when they rush at a summoner, or do you think it varies?
I think they're strongest when they have that controlled aggression we were talking about before. And what that generally looks like is Sunderved with a gate that is, on the fourth or fifth or the opponent's side, and then a bunch of units. I wouldn't go like all the way chasing the summoner like I would with Grognak or Celeste from the Wayfarers or things like that. But if you are just kind of camped out in the middle of the board, in the like opponent side of the board with a bunch of stuff, that's when I feel like it's the absolute strongest with them. You can play them a lot of different ways, but that's like Jexic is saying, right? There's only that most everything is melee, and so you do want to be meeting them up in there and having Sunderbed give the boost to things to have the strongest attacks up there.
So you're saying you want to try to get like, as far as the gate placement, like a B5 or an E5 kind of gate up there that's just sort of like a forward base to camp out in.
Yeah, I think one of the factions I enjoy playing against the most with the Vargath is the Polar Dwarves. And a lot of that is because they move their gates around and stuff. You can just set up a gate where normally their 10 health gate would start if you're able to like properly move up in that kind of way. And so then you're just kind of in the way of all their stuff. That area is more clear and open than it is against a lot of factions if they're moving around that 10 health into different areas. So like that I would be the ideal placement for me. Or like kind of the kitty corner to their opponent's gate is one I really like going, where you're not directly on top of the gate or to the side of it, but you're directly diagonal to it, is one I like because then you can summon something onto it and block the gate spots and things.
When you do place these forward gates, are you ever someone that likes to play a stronghold to do an aggressive push, like pull guys up to your gate, or is it almost always defensively?
I like using a lot of aggressive strongholds, specifically for like what I'm just talking about, putting it on that corner because then it's blocking the summoning stuff.
Diagonal spot and then taking their spots. Yeah, that's a neat trick. Might have to try that.
Stronghold is good to be like get out of dodge a lot, but if you're just using it to protect your stuff and you don't have a plan after that, it can be kind of like you brought all of this aggression to them and then you just let them off the hook, kind of. And so,
Yeah, I feel like sometimes I'm like relieved when someone misuses stronghold. It's like, oh, I'm off the hook. Like, yeah, you said off the hook, or just like you get to breathe. Like, oh, they were causing all this forward pressure, and now they're just relieving the pressure.
totally. It's when to use it is, and that's just comes with like learning it and different people's taste of, are you a super risk taker Obsidian Dwarfs player or are you a super scary cat like, I don't know, Savannah Elves player or something? I don't know if that's the right faction, but it's just like a matter of personal preference. But I think if you are leaning towards Obsidian Dwarfs but not going all that way, you're going to have the best time with these guys.
Yeah, I feel like the Vargath are almost like a back to basics for Summoner Wars. It's a lot about positioning. It's a lot about just like getting the most out of your attacks and just making sure you're lined up in the right position for like slingers to get the most of it, and brutes and fighters, and to get your martial forces and stuff to go through and get the most out of Sunderved's ability to get that extra value.
It's completely about positioning and the aura you're talking about with Thunderbed. And then just brutes in general force that too, right? Them only being able to move one. It could be a weakness in so many decks, but if you're playing these guys right, then you're always being able to use their ability and use their perceived weakness as a strength in the fact that they're up in the front. And so then it's not a weakness anymore.
The one thing we haven't talked about yet is the various matchups. Aside from like specific things we've talked about, certain matchups, but like I've heard some people say they think Mountain Vargath have the most even matchups and not as many lopsided ones. Would you agree with that, or are there some that you want to highlight?
I definitely agree with that. I think they are really strong because they're so adaptable, and also they're just so high health that they are a tough matchup for a lot of things. There's definitely ones that are tougher than others, but I think they match up well into pretty much every deck. Like, I'm not going into any matchup thinking like, ah, all right, I guess I'll try. Like, I feel with the Vargath, like you are pretty well set up against every faction.
Do you feel like there's any that they have it a little bit easier against? Like if somebody's playing the Vargath for the first time and they want to play an easier matchup, like what do you think's their easiest one?
Probably just Vanguard, just because they're also a melee faction and they don't have a ton of explosiveness. So that you're gonna be able to use your high health to your advantage. The Vanguard are one of the weaker ones just in general, so that's not necessarily the most surprising. But I think they're probably the most slanted of the matchups. Even then, it's like Vanguard obviously have a chance in that. It's closer to even than a lot of more lopsided matchups in this game, but I think that's probably their best one. There are a couple others I thought about as kind of strong. Like in theory, Fallen Kingdom would be one that's really strong, but the explosiveness and the fact that you do want your summoner involved in a lot of this, even if it's behind like a protection from a Glory Caller or a Brute, the Fallen Kingdom have so many ways around that it's a little scary.
I guess if there's not many lopsided matchups, which ones do you think are like the most dynamic and fun? That like just they kind of mesh well into it. I guess you mentioned Polar Dwarves is one. What's another one?
Polar Dwarves is one for sure. I think the Wayfarers is one that's really fun because you get to play more defensively and use all your tricks in that way, or use them to surround Celeste or something like that. I think that's a really good one. Something like High Elves is really fun to think about and plan around. If they're going to be able to force your stuff out of the way, how do you counter that and things like that? How do you gain a boost? Like if you have Thunderved plus a war giving your things double boost, like that is really powerful if you're able to ever pull that off. Or Peace, if you're able to move all the way up with that too, having your things have so much health, and then Peace on top of that is really powerful.
Yeah, the tough ability.
So the goal is you also pair it with loyalty and liberty. So you got 3 bonus attack value or 3 bonus strength, and you can attack twice. Just somebody let that happen for a Vargath player.
And use the glory collars to get the guys into place.
Use the Glory Caller all the way. That would be a 4. That would be an 8/4 for one cost. That's pretty good. Glory Callers are no longer understated at that point. That's for sure.
Nah, 8/4 understated.
I mean, it's almost a warrior and then Deepwood Grokes. But yeah, I think that they have a couple tough matchups too. But even their ones that are tough, if you think about the Shadow Elves or the Deepwood Grokes, they have ways to get to your slingers, which is really like you want to keep those protected. And if a Seer can hit it or a Ranger, Sage Ranger can get at it, then it feels pretty bad. But that often comes at the cost of leaving them a little bit more exposed or things like that. And the Vargath are so strong in a lot of other ways that I still feel good in those matchups. Shadow Elves, in my mind, would be their hardest matchup. But then I looked at the stats before doing this podcast, and I have won 2/3 of my games against Shadow Elves, and I played them a pretty decent chunk. It's definitely winnable.
So like you mentioned before, you've played and talked to Ben on stream, but like he likes playing games live. What have you thought about the live tournament scene? Because I know you've been to Gen Con a couple times.
Yeah, I love playing live. It's absolutely my favorite way to play this game. Playing and thinking the best possible way over hours and hours, getting the perfect turn is fun, but I would much rather just be playing and taking it a little less seriously while also trying my hardest to grind this person into dust who's across from me. But I love playing live. That's how I started playing this game and played a lot of games before getting online. And at Gen Con, the Gen Con tournaments have been a ton of fun. I've been the last couple years now, the last 2 years. And the first year I went, it was funny to see, like, there were definitely some people who had maybe played this game a couple times and they just wanted to come because they were at Gen Con and play in the tournament, versus there was also Orange Lazarus was there, right? So it's like
who flew in just for it, just for that tournament, and then wins it all and goes home.
So the contrast in that, I think the first year I did it, there were 4 people who were in league in the whole tournament, and there were maybe 16 or 32, I think, was the breakdown of how many people were there. I have to tell the story here because I'm still salty about it. I was in the semifinals. I was undefeated going into my 4th game, and there were 5 total games in this tournament. And I was playing against Backcountry Gamer, who's on the Discord and in league and stuff. And the way it was worked so that people wouldn't take 3 days to do their games is after 50 minutes, every turn you would take after that, your summoner would take 1 damage, is how it would work.
Oh.
And so I was playing against him, and our game went a little bit over, and I was Tundra Orcs too. And the first couple of hands I had in the game were really rough, where I couldn't summon anything. So I had to use Grognak and aggressively. But at the point where we reached 50 minutes, I had so much stuff on the board, and I just had a couple health Grognak, but he was completely squirreled away in safety, and it just he just expired because time ran out, and I was so mad about it.
And so you guys didn't have chess clocks to keep track of time earlier in the
No,
game?
we didn't have chess clocks that year. Thankfully, the second year I went, they brought chess clocks, and that was the way we did it. But it was just 50 minutes after that, your summoner takes 1 damage every turn. And he ended up just running away, so that even though I had all this stuff on the board, he just was able to win. It was frustrating.
That's a
And he ended up going against Orange Lazarus in the final, and they had a Polar Dwarf mirror match, which this was Polar
Which
Dwarves.
they'd never played before.
Polar Dwarves pre-nerf.
Old Ice Ram.
All this. That was when they were super strong. And then this last year, the tournament was really fun, and I think probably 2/3 of the people were in league, which was really fun. And that's where I met Ben 10. I brought Davoud down there too, who almost won the whole thing. There were a lot of really good players in it. Someone cosplayed as Sarah, which was awesome.
Oh yeah, I remember that.
From the Vanguards. Yeah, it was really fun, and just the level of skill in it was really cool to see how good everyone was, and everyone's trying their absolute best. And the chess clocks there made it a lot better, in my opinion.
I think live events can be so much fun. Did you grind Ben into dust like you were talking about?
I did, actually. We played his Shadow Elves versus my Obsidian Dwarves, and I just eviscerated everything on his board. Which is the most satisfying thing possible, because Shadow Elves are so frustrating to play against sometimes.
This will be something of a topic for another cast, but I feel like sometimes Obsidian Dwarves match up well into the 2 elf factions, the Savannah Elves and the Shadow Elves, just because they're good at finishing targets. So it's you can't bounce your something if it's dead, So if you can just kind of maintain momentum with them, you can do pretty well.
At their most defensive, if the Shadow Elves play too defensive or the other elves, then Obsidian Dwarves will pounce on that, right, and absolutely wreck it. But yeah, I've loved the live tournaments. I've loved meeting up with a bunch of people from the Discord and playing against them in person. And I mean, we all love this game an unhealthy amount, right? So it's nice to meet people in the real world who are at that level. Same with talking to you guys, right?
I mean, that's why we made this, right? Just get more Summoner Wars all the time.
Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah, I think we need to push Plaid Hat to do more live tournaments, because they do Gen Con, which is probably their biggest venue. But I feel like people would show up if they did it at other conventions, because they go to some other conventions, but they just don't do.
Or even, I mean, they're fairly centrally located in Ohio. If they just did an Ohio tournament another time, separate from Gen Con or whatever, it's something they could think about. Or we can pester them.
Something we haven't talked about yet. Pivoting back to the Vargath for a little bit. What cards do you end up discarding the most for Magic? Because all their cards are pretty viable. So going into, is it very matchup dependent, or how do you feel like you approach discarding their cards for Magic?
Yeah, I think one for me that's almost an auto discard is Quinn, and then a lot of times Torridin. I mean, that's the case with a lot of champs in a lot of decks, right? You're not going to be able to play them all. On top of that, I would just discard commons, because you're going to see more of them. and you need to have a couple for them to be successful. If you just have one common on the board, it's not going to be a really viable strategy. But if you have two or three, then you're able to get, then you got a stew going, and everything works together.
All your ingredients.
Yeah, exactly.
I feel like, and just the fact that if you don't have the magic, you're not going to summon any of the commons, so you got to discard a couple, and you will get more. I think the only one I'm hesitant personally to discard is probably Slingers, just because they're your only ranged unit, especially if you're discarding Quen. But otherwise, I think I agree with that statement.
I agree with that too. I'll still discard one or two just in case, like if I need to, but it's the one I'm most resistant to discard. If it's a game against something like the Vanguards or something that's really melee focused, I'll almost never discard the Brutes just because they're so good and so strong in that type of game. Whereas if I'm going against Breakers, right, Brutes are having a really tough time. That's another thing too with their events. I think I discard, like, you're almost never going to get two rammings off, so discarding one of those is usually a good call, and discarding both if you're not able to set it up. And then Battle Leader too. If you are not really able to see a play for it where you're also protecting Sunderbed afterwards, using a Martial Forces, using a Barn or a Stronghold or something like that, then I will tend to discard one of those. But you really do want to use it if you can. And then Martial Forces, I'm always going to keep. That's just always strong.
Probably hard not to find a time to use Martial Force.
Yeah,
It's going to be cool.
Yeah, I think Martial Forces is probably their most flexible and strongest event. I find that sometimes, and I'm not saying this is always the best strategy, but I find that sometimes I will use Battle Leader just for the movement. Feels bad. 4 movement can be worth it, I feel like.
That does feel bad. But I never took.
But sometimes you want to get your other 3 guys in to get attacks in, and then you're like, whoa, but Sundervid also needs to be there. So yeah, I could see doing that too. Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, if you can move Sundervid into a position that gains you like 2 or 3 like strength on your other guys with a Battle Leader, I feel like it's then maybe worth it. You're not gaining the Sundervid attack necessarily. Sometimes I feel like it's better than discarding it for magic. Sometimes it's not. Sometimes it doesn't work well.
I have done that a couple of times too, but it definitely doesn't feel good, and you want to be able to use it the way it's strongest.
Get that 5 attack in, or 6 with ramming advance. Boom.
By the way, going back to Martial Forces, we were talking about how strong it is and how versatile it is. I thought it was so interesting that when we were just seeing the previews for the cards and everything, I was talking about it with somebody, and they were like, "Oh, Martial Forces, it's just the exact same event as Oblige, but only friendly units. Oblige in the High Elves deck." And then when you play the deck, it plays so differently than that event, even though like the wording on the card is so similar. It is really cool how they were able to design like almost the same card, but have it do such completely different things in these decks. Like, I just think that's such a cool thing that this deck is able to do, and they're able to do.
I mean, I think the fact that Oblige does affect opponents, and just with Engage, the greater Engage makes it a very different kind of play. But it's interesting how close they are, for sure.
Do you think that the Mountain Vargath line up strongly overall? Like, if you had to rank them in, what do we got, 24 factions right now?
22, I think.
22?
Yeah.
24 soon.
5 by the time this comes out, yeah.
Yeah, by the time this comes out, probably going to be 24. But 22 factions, where do you think they fall?
I think they're near the top. They're probably not the top, just because there's ones that are strong to the point of oppressive in certain matchups and strong in other matchups. But I think they're strong in almost every matchup. There's a couple that they're like relatively weak in, but even their relative weakness, they're still able to have a ton of health. They're still able to hit hard. They're still have all these different tricks and things in order to keep their stuff safe or keep their stuff aggressive if they want to go that way. I think they're really strong, and I'd say, like, if we're doing tiers, there's like the S tier decks, which is a couple, and then they're right below that, A plus tier, A tier, whatever you want to say.
Noted. We'll think about that when we make our tier list.
Yeah, I feel like they're probably around that area. I think it's tough because there's so many strong decks in Summoner Wars. Like they could be A plus tier and be like 11th in like the rankings, which is like the halfway point. So, but I think they're definitely a strong deck. I think people glance at them when they see them for the first time and think that they're just kind of vanilla and there's not like as much going on. But once you get into all those like tricks that they can pull and all the flexibility they have to play basically any way they want, whether it's aggressive or defensive or playing that econ value game, they're a very strong deck that can basically have almost no bad matchups.
And I think the other thing is that they're still relatively new, so I think there's still time with how flexible they are and how they don't seem to have too many bad matchups that we could see new things explored and people do even better with them.
I totally agree. And I think exactly what you're saying, Aaron, is true. When we see Wayfarers come out, we say, okay, this is an aggressive deck, and this is how they're aggressive. Or you see like High Elves come out, and it's like, okay, this is a deck, get set up your little fortress with the piece, like they're pretty good at playing defense. Whereas these guys, it's not super apparent to see exactly where that strength comes from, but that alone is their strength. Is like that the fact that they're so versatile and they're strong in a lot of these other ways that are hidden or just like not as apparent to the naked eye. I think that's a really good job just of designing the deck that they have done, because you see a lot of the new ones coming out lean all the way one way, aggressive or defensive, or they have this one specific strategy. And these guys really seem kind of like a throwback to the Polar Dwarves or a throwback to the Savannah Elves, where you can play like this defensive style or this aggressive style either way, but which one's the strongest every game is going to be different. And so I think they're really powerful in that way. And it's not as apparent when you are just looking at them from afar necessarily. But if you get in there and play a bunch, you really do see it.
We appreciate you coming on to talk about the Vargath.
Yeah, thanks for having me. It's been great.
Yeah, thanks for coming on.
If anybody wants to get connected with you or maybe play a friendly match, is the Discord the best place to find you?
Hit me up at the Discord, Beaneasly on there. And if you're going to Gen Con, hit me up too. It would be great to play against you in person in the tournament. I know, I think Ben 10's going to be there as well, although not 100% sure on that. Davood will definitely be there, and we can get some games in. That'd be fun.
Glad to hear it. Maybe Discard for Magic will at some point make their first Gen Con appearance. Who knows? Who knows?
That would be great. It's not too far from y'all.
Well, we appreciate you all listening, and this has been Discard for Magic. We'll see you guys in a couple weeks.